And now we are joined by a member of Congress with a very unique background and perspective on the state of higher education today. Congresswoman Donna Shalala has led colleges, and lots of colleges and universities, and holds the distinction of being the longest-serving Secretary of Health and Human Services. Congresswoman Shalala, thanks so much for joining us today. You know, we've been talking all day about what needs to be disrupted and shifted in education. But I got to tell you where I want to start, because I know you've thought about different dimensions of this, is how should education at all levels fit into the equation of how we think about democracy? We don't talk enough about that, and I'm wondering how you frame it.
Well, I frame it because the great public school system in this country was created to create a nation. People of different backgrounds, rich and poor, going to school together, from different neighborhoods. And the founders of our public school system were thinking about democracy when they put together education for all. Our system, because of housing disbursement, has changed over the years, but it still plays a critical role in educating the next generation of leaders in our country. Most of them will come from our public school system, despite the fact that we have a strong private school system, obviously, particularly for wealthier people. So I think of public education as democracy building in this country, because that's the way the founders actually saw it. They also saw elementary, middle school, high school as a stepping stone to higher education for a certain percentage of the population, and set standards for access to the great land-grant universities by setting high standards, particularly in the high schools, for admissions.
You know, you're on the Education and Labor Committee in the House, and I'm wondering, you know, what is the legislative priorities there look like? What are the things that you're investing time and effort in right now?
Well, we've been focused on COVID, obviously, on helping our school systems, particularly our public school systems, adjust to a COVID reality. And that is, most of our kids have gone to school remotely. We weren't ready for that. So putting resources into remote learning has been important, but it's created gaps. Not simply for low-income kids, but for middle-income kids as well, because it's not as good to have the teacher in the classroom interacting with the students. We've done our best with virtual learning. I represent the fourth largest school system in the country and the second largest minority school system. We've distributed over 100,000 laptops to the kids in our districts, and that gives you a sense of where the gaps are. But it's been a big burden on parents, and I actually think parents really appreciate teachers more once they've had their kids at home and had to basically supervise them in their remote learning. For higher education, it has simply been devastating. And we have provided resources to the states to provide resources to their higher educational institutions, particularly focused on low-income kids, to make sure that they could pay for their tuition, to make sure we built in some shortfalls for higher education. But we haven't done enough, as there is no substitute for face-to-face learning, either in higher education or in high school or in elementary school. There simply is not a substitute for that. We've got a lot of work to do, just helping the schools in this country, the public schools, with their ventilation systems. I think the CBO or the GAO said about 40% of them really don't have the ventilation systems you should have if you're really going to bring kids back to school during COVID-19.
You know, I want to remind our viewers that you were the president of Hunter College of the City University of New York, chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, president of the University of Miami. I mean, you covered a lot of it looked like you were running for office all over the country.
You know, Steve, I started out teaching at Teachers College at Columbia University, so I spent a lot of time teaching the politics of education, not of higher education, but of elementary and secondary education.
So So let me ask
as
you.
well. And at Hunter, I was responsible for Hunter Elementary School and Hunter High School.
Wow. So let me ask you,
So
given all of that experience, given your, the deployment of these different institutions, one of my favorite educators beyond yourself is Eduardo Padron, the president emeritus of Miami-Dade College.
my close friend.
I mean, I've always learned something from interviewing Eduardo. And for those of viewers who don't know, Miami-Dade College is one of the largest community colleges in the country. It's sort of every kind of mix of person that you can imagine, very nimble when it comes to thinking about both about education and credentialing to give people, way through these different, particularly low income and sort of underserved communities. So I'm interested in, given your educational background, what can the kind of the high and mighty schools learn from the Eduardo Padrones? What do you think has to change in education, particularly in higher education, to make it more relevant? I'm looking at student debt that people are going to have a hard time paying off. What can they do, if you think it's right, to become more like what Padron did at Miami-Dade College?
Well, first of all, what Miami-Dade College did, particularly under Eduardo Padron, is offer opportunity no matter what your earlier credentials were. That is the importance of institutions like his. And many of those young people went on to four-year institutions, but many of them were in training so that they could work in hospitals and in other kinds of institutions. It prepared them for jobs. What higher education can learn is it can learn a lot about opportunity. That SATs are not a good measure of drive and necessarily ability. They may be good measures of what your grades are going to be, but even they can't substitute for the passion that someone has to lift themselves out of poverty. I was a working class kid that went to a fancy private college, and it took me some time to catch up, but it was my passion and my parents' passion for education, because my father had an 8th grade education. And I saw at Hunter College and at the University of Wisconsin and again at Miami, generations of first generation kids, but also first generations to go to college, kids that came off the farms in Wisconsin, kids that had just moved to the United States at Hunter. And their passion and drive needs to be rewarded, not with debt, but with opportunity. And the debt situation in the United States is a disaster.
I know it's huge. Another issue, we had just a short while ago on this show, Jessica Rosenworcel, commissioner of the FCC, talking about E-rate, talking about the digital divide. But Congresswoman, I've been surprised how little the digital divide issues have been talked about thus far in the presidential campaigns, that when we talk about the coming era of 5G and hyperconnectivity and data flying and new sensors, as we see this experiment with children at home and living online, do you think that's going to come around as an issue? Do you think that I just know a lot of kids both in cities and also in rural areas in Appalachia that do not have that digital infrastructure that those that have it do have. Do you find that to be an important divide in the country that we have to fix?
Absolutely. We need to close it. And we need to close it in the next couple of years. There's no question about it. And Democrats are really focused on this, led by the whip, Representative Clyburn, who has taken up this issue. And we've passed bills to close that divide. They have not been introduced in the Senate. This ought to be bipartisan. It ought to be nonpartisan because this is about opportunity. And it's about fundamentally what this country is about. The opportunity ought not to depend on where you live or who your parents were or what your religion is. Justice ought to be served, and educational justice involves giving everybody the same access to information.
Well, thank you for that. Now, I know you have a new member of your family and an entrant in the cutest dog in Congress competition. Would you like to share with our audience your new family member?
Sure. This little fella was found running around in my district, actually in Coconut Grove, for a couple of months. And one of the rescue groups picked him up. He had actually run into an Italian restaurant where they finally caught him. So they said, you have to give him an Italian name. So meet Fauci.
Well, Fauci,
And
it's nice.
I did send a picture of him to Tony.
Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman Donna Shalala. It's always good to talk to you and learn from you. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for the time from Fauci too.
Thank you. Thank you.